I should introduce Jan Albers. Apparently, her career included teaching at Yale, the University of Sussex, Middlebury, and St. Michael's. And she was the former director of the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury and now serves as president of the Vermont Historical Society. I hope that's all true.
That is all true. I swear.
What I do know is that she wrote Hands on the Land, which I'm sure everyone in this room has read, but there is a copy over there if you want to look at it again. And if you order it, shop.org or something like that. So, great, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Polly, and my apologies to everyone for being late. And I'm thrilled to see such a great turnout. When I was running the Sheldon Museum, we used to always hope for a rainy day in the summer because that's when you got a lot more people. So it's working here too, I think. So anyway, and also I'll add that I grew up on a dairy farm. So I'm not a sheep farmer, but I am a farm girl. So, well, a lot of people are interested, and we've all, growing up in Vermont, you always hear about the Merino sheep boom, and a lot of people have been interested in it, and so I hope you'll learn something today. But, Merinos aren't over. If you open any high-end catalog, or even a darn tough, Vermont darn tough sock ad, it doesn't take much effort to find quality merino goods that are still in the marketplace. From hats to jackets to sweaters to socks, you can outfit yourself top to bottom in merino. And it's generally regarded as the highest quality wool on the market. It's known for being soft. Even those of us allergic to wool can wear merino usually. And it's got a special insulating ability. It's moisture wicking. Qualities are unusual, and it keeps you dry, and it has the natural antibacterial qualities as well, because it has natural lanolin in it. And so it is the very most special kind of wool, even today. Since cashmere doesn't come from sheep, of course. So merino is the most desirable wool in the marketplace. And you'd think that this wonder wool is a new development, but merino sheep have been around in Europe since the late Middle Ages. High up in the cool hills over Madrid, which is on a hot plain. There are hills above it. The Spanish kings used to retreat in summer to their palace at El Escorial, which is there. And they developed these very special sheep with long, silky hair with a lot of lanolin and kind of a crinkled quality. They have crinkles in the fibers they're producing in their fleece. And so this gave kind of an intrinsic insulation. But despite their exceptional qualities, the merinos were really easy to raise because they were adaptable. They were able to graze on the flats or spend summers in the rocky mountain pastures, and which were much like those of Vermont, as you can imagine. So as you'll see in this talk, the merino road from early modern Spain to worldwide 20th century retail runs right through Vermont. By the 17th century, these wonder sheep were so highly prized that it was illegal for anyone but the Spanish monarchs to own a flock. They had the market on merinos, and an occasional pair might be given to a distinguished royal or diplomat from another country, but almost all of them remained in the royal farms of the Iberian Peninsula. One way to know a precious animal in this period was for its elite master to pay to have it painted. The first painting featuring a merino is one by Bartolomé Esteban Murillo for a royal Spanish farm. The Good Shepherd is traditionally a parable of Jesus, who here cares for his own little Merino. I think that's such a sweet painting. This Spanish royal exclusivity was all to change thanks to Napoleon. How did he get in this story? King Ferdinand VII had barely come to the throne in 1808 when Napoleon overthrew him and conquered Spain in the Peninsular War. Napoleon and his troops soon began seizing large estates filled with merinos. To keep the sheep from being taken off to France and to raise money to fight their enemy, the Spanish elite panicked and lifted their blockade on exporting merinos in order to raise funds to continue the fight against Napoleon's armies. Ferdinand's loss was Vermont's gain, because you may have heard of this guy. In 1810, a Boston Brahmin named William Jarvis, who President Jefferson had made the U.S. consul to Lisbon, got a license from the Spanish government to export 3,638 merinos. He sold some to people from Virginia to New England and presented gifts of prime breeding stock to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had been eager to try raising these miraculous merinos, and Jarvis was happy to be able to make this possible. Ever the diplomat, he wrote to Jefferson to say, "Sir, my veneration for you being in no wise lessened by your secession from office, I hope you will allow me again to trespass on your goodness with a small present, which I trust from your patriotism will not be unacceptable. After much exertion, I have been able to obtain a few merino sheep warranted of the best of the breed in Spain, and thinking the climate of Virginia more favorable for their propagation, as more resembling that of Spain than the northern states, I cannot forbear, sir, making you an offer of a ram and a ewe, both as a mark of my great esteem, and well knowing that the experiment cannot be in better hands. I pray you, sir, to do me the honor of their acceptance. Least, sir, the idea of expense should deter you. Allow me to say that they did not cost me very much, having gotten them at a reasonable price by the assistance of a Spanish gentleman." So this was sent from Lisbon in January 1810. Jefferson replied a year later. I guess it wasn't on the top of the pile. But anyway, in an especial manner, I must acknowledge your last favors by putting me on the list of those who are enabled to extend the improvement of one of the most valuable races of our domestic animals. The 4 merinos are now safe with me here, and good preparations made for their increase in the ensuing season. Pursuing the spirit of the liberal donor, I consider them as deposited with me for the general good, and divesting myself of all views of gain, I propose to devote them to the division of the race throughout our state, diffusion of the race throughout our state. As far as their increase shall permit, I shall send a pair to every county of the state in rotation until the whole are possessed of them. Later visitors to Jefferson recorded his wearing clothing made from his own merino sheep, and merinos are now not forgotten at Monticello. While researching this talk, I noticed the estate's gift shop shows merino sweaters on sale at Monticello. So that's kind of cool. What kind of a world were these well-traveled Spanish sheep coming to? In the first decades of the 19th century, Vermont was not very similar to Monticello. Much of Vermont was still largely a frontier. The settlers had made a good start at clearing land, and towns and villages were starting to spring up. There were new grist mills were being developed and sawmills were coming, but there were plenty of rugged and undeveloped places away from the two major valleys in the state. The overwhelming majority of the new state's residents were farmers and agricultural workers. Now, farms have traditionally been seen as falling into two broad categories. There are diversified farms and there are specialized farms. And the relative merits of the two different kinds of farming had been debated for at least a couple of centuries by the time we're talking about here. On a diversified farm, the farm family raised a little bit of everything. You might have a flock of sheep, you might have cows, you might have a pair of oxen if you were really lucky in early Vermont. They were helped to clear those old hardwood trees you were trying to get out of the way, as they thought of it then. You know, you just have a little bit of everything so that you didn't, because there wasn't much cash around. So you couldn't really just go to the store and buy much of anything. So, you know, people bartered, they swapped, and they had so if you had a diverse amount of things you could barter with, that was a real help as well for those few things you couldn't supply for yourself. And so in early Vermont, most farms were diversified. The idealized view of a settler's home shows such a farm in settlement days. Those days were still happening in much of Vermont in the 1810s, though villages and towns were now dotting the landscape, and many virgin forests had been cleared. The particularly in the valleys, in the Champlain Valley and in the Connecticut Valley, almost all of these farms had the cows, pigs, sheep, horse, ox. Then there was Indian meal, as they called it, which was Indian corn, which they could make into meal and which they could eat. They could feed to their animals, of course. And there were what the settlers called Indian vegetables, which were pumpkin, squash, and beans. And maple trees were tapped in the spring, so they had most of their syrup was turned into sugar rather than syrup, most of their maple sap. And there were fruit orchards in the Connecticut Valley as early as the 1790s. Farmers soon realized apples were particularly well suited to the valleys of Vermont. And a good share of the harvest went into making hard cider. Although the new industry received a setback when, after 1830, thousands of apple trees were pulled up under pressure from the temperance movement. They just saw, so you've got all these beautiful apples. No way, we don't trust you to raise apples. So, but some farmers were getting frustrated, feeling that this was no way to get ahead. They were supplying their family's needs, but you know, you couldn't really get ahead. They wanted the greater riches that specialization can bring. Because if you find something and you specialize in it, you have a surplus that you can sell. And so they started thinking about, you know, what they might be able to specialize in. And the idea that really hit people came from William Jarvis's Merinos. It was not yet a dairy state. It's difficult to change from a barter economy to a capitalist one when money is tight, credit almost non-existent, and agriculture is so unspecialized that almost nobody has a surplus of anything to sell. You can't get rich on a subsistence farm. You must be able to specialize so that you have something to offer. In 1811, Vermonters were poised on the brink of their first great period of capitalist expansion, but they didn't yet know whether they would be able to pull anything off. So Jarvis was the man for the times. He was generous with his new flock and enjoyed a profit by selling Merino breeding stock to farmers around the state. And it wasn't just Jarvis. In 1810 and 11, about 20,000 Merinos poured into New England and New York. The first Merinos did not impress Vermonters, who were used to the sturdy native breeds of sheep, more suited to lamb chops than loom yarn. Merinos had small frames, even though you'll see old drawings of them, they look the size of a barn, they look the size of a barn. Yeah, that's advertising. Anyway, they had these small frames, great wrinkles in their skin, and so much lanolin or yoke, as they called it, that their fleece attracted a lot of dirt, as you can see. At first, the locals didn't think much of these dirty little lambs. Looking back on seeing his first merino, William R. Sanford reminisced in 1865, I can well remember the first merino ram brought into my neighborhood. He was small and he had short wool, which was very dark and crusty on its outer ends. So strong was the prejudice against him that one person gave notice to his owner that if he got into his lot with his native sheep, he would shoot him. But after a few experiments, the tide turned strongly in favor of the merinos. So merinos were known for this lanolin, this yoke in their fleece, which gave it kind of a greasy look and caused dirt and other impurities to stick to it. Before shearing, a merino could look very grubby and unkempt. And so this lanolin, though, had the advantage of making the unwashed cuttings heavier, therefore bringing a higher profit by weight. So you wanted really yolky fleeces. That was considered a good deal. This could lead unscrupulous sellers to pass off inferior fleeces as merino breeding stock by concocting a mixture of linseed oil and burnt umber and lamp black that closely looked like the real thing, the real merino yoke, known as the Cornwall finish. Not wanting to cast any aspersions on my neighboring town, I'm in next door Weybridge, but the Cornwall finish was almost impossible to detect when they were sent to market in places like Ohio. By the time a rainfall washed it off, exposing the deception, the sellers were halfway back to Vermont. So the breed took off with lightning speed. Everyone with a piece of pasture wanted merinos. By the 1820s, merino sheep had almost totally supplanted the native breeds. Vermonters believed their state was particularly suited to merinos, and the Champlain Valley was proving to be perfect sheep country. It was said that on every hillside the flocks were grazing. Americans had fought for their own independence and now wanted a sheep industry that would be independent of England and the rest of Europe. The rate of growth was amazing. Farmers whose fathers and grandfathers had cut the virgin forest to clear land for hard-scrabble living on subsistence farms were now finding there were big profits to be made by specializing in one thing. So breeders like the Wilcoxes of Orwell and the Jewetts of Weybridge were making a killing. Merinos with fleeces, they were making a killing breeding merinos with fleeces heavier than ever before. Sheep take a lot of grazing land. The big operators were expanding rapidly, buying out the smaller, more marginal farmers around them to expand their sheep pastures. Concerned about this trend, a Vermont Chronicle editorialist in Windsor was exhorting his readers in 1834, beware of the Western fever, and above all, sell not your farms to your rich neighbors for sheep pastures, because the big guys were kept trying to eat up all the little farmers It still happens. So there was reason to worry as some of these consolidations led to blights on the landscape. When the smaller farmers sold up and moved west, it paid the well-to-do to buy up the small places, use the barns for sheepfolds, and just let the houses fall into their cellars. They just didn't do anything with the houses. So if you look at this slide, an 1837 survey of animal numbers found that except for the tops of the mountains and the Northeast Kingdom, every county in Vermont had at least 1,000 sheep. Rutland had the most with 180,984, with Orwell having the most in Rutland County. Then Windsor with 171,581, with Springfield in the lead, and Addison with 159,411, where Shoreham had the most. Totals for the state were 1,099,011 merinos altogether. There were 70 woolen mills. Total wool produced was 3,571,786 pounds. Total profit was $1,803,751. Wool growing, as it was called, had become a massive industry. By 1825, many Vermont merino farmers were clearing $1,000 to $200,000 a year in cash, a sum that couldn't have been imagined 10 years before. That was a massive fortune in that period. In 1830, Vermont merinos gave Woolworth $1.2 million, 3 million pounds of wool at 36 cents a pound. By 1840, at its height, there were 1,681,000 sheep in Vermont, 6 times the human population. So there were 6 sheep for every one of us. It's a good thing they didn't turn on us. Luckily they aren't that kind of animal. But sheep could be found all over the state. But as you see, the biggest flocks were in the Champlain Valley, the Connecticut Valley, and Orange County. The sheep were increasing in productivity. Breeders were making enormous advances in the density of the fleeces. So the weight of a clip had averaged 1 pound in 1839, now was like 2.4 pounds. And that's even without the Cornwall finish. So by 1849, they were getting a lot more off of every sheep. And some prized lambs had fleeces of 12 pounds, which was completely unheard of. The boom was part of a larger transformation of the landscape as the clearing of trees for agriculture moved from the valleys right up the mountainsides. How many of you have watched All Creatures Great and Small? You know what it looks like in the Yorkshire Dales, where it's almost, it's almost all, there are almost no trees at all. There are stone fences going up and down the hills, and there's almost nothing but grass. And the Green Mountains would have looked a lot like the Yorkshire Dales do today, with their sheep-filled pastures. Our hills are somewhat higher, yet over the course of the century, Vermont became 75% deforested. I mean, try to imagine, we're now 75% forested again. But at that point, we were 75% deforested. It was just all these bare hillsides with the sheep, chomping away on them. Sheep can graze almost anywhere, and small flocks kept the hill farms going for a few decades. But the most successful merino farms then and now were in the valleys, especially in Addison County, which soon had, 11 sheep per capita and produced more wool per acre than any county in America. The king of sheep, the sheep of kings had become the king of sheep. And Addison County got a reputation for having the greatest merinos in the world. There was a pattern to the merino year. I don't know, have any of you ever sheared a sheep? Well, it's a lot easier now, you know. But this is what it used to take. Lambing time was March days and nights, while May was shearing time. Accounts of sheep shearing are something like the communal stories of haying in later generations. The Quaker Robinson family at Rokeby in Ferrisburg invested in a flock of merinos early on. And Rowland E. Robinson remembered the fun of shearing time. A team of neighbors would all come over to your place and they'd work together, jesting and telling of merry tales from morning till night and bursts of laughter, he said. The farmers, who were the most expert shearers, could do 25 to 35 sheep a day with those. Can you even imagine? It's unimaginable. Managing to remove the whole heavy fleece in one piece. Just unzipped it somehow. It was a tricky job because merinos have natural folds in their skin. I mean, imagine trying to shear this famous Cornwall ram named Wrinkly. Why wrinkly? I think you can see that. The folds made them harder to shear, but also meant the fleeces themselves were bigger when you spread them out. So once you got it off, it was like, this, and then you spread them out, and they were pretty impressive. A later observer said that merino sheep's fleeces were so thick you could open them like a book. Then the fleeces were carefully tied into bundles for shipping to markets and mills. While the men were wrestling with merinos, the women and girls were what? Indoors cooking, right? They were indoors cooking up the big shearing day meals for them, a social time to share with your neighbors when the work was done. Many fleeces were bundled off to be sold to the new woolen mills in southern Vermont, Massachusetts, and New York. Many went through a wool shipping depot at Larrabee's Point in Shoreham on Lake Champlain, where they were transported over water. Local mills started springing up around, this one is in Middlebury, they started springing up around the state where we were making our own, woolen cloth. And by 1836, there were 136 woolen mills in the state. There were 150 by 1850. Local people, including women and teenage girls, got jobs in those mills, providing a new way for farm girls to come to town and support themselves. In fact, the Sheldon Museum has a big series of letters that mill girls sent home and letters they got from their families telling, I promise I went to church, and stuff like that. There's a lot of that. Just, Mommy, I did. So I can tell you about one enterprising young woman. Helen Brittell grew up in a brick house in Weybridge built by her father, a clothier named Orange Brittell. He had a woolen mill on a small Otter Creek waterfall in their backyard. Helen lost her mother early, and so she was often helping with her younger brother and sister. And she was sewing and doing all kinds of things around the house. But in her memoir, she told of how her father taught her to run all the machines in the woolen mill in the yard as well when she was still small enough to need to stand on a box, just in case it was an emergency. This knowledge came in handy for this bright young girl one summer day, as she later wrote in her memoir. I remember now one beautiful morning when Father went to Vergennes for dyestuffs and oil for his factory. He gave my sister and me the day to visit a friend in the country. So we were going to go see Louisa Jewett. Her father, Solomon Jewett, was a rich farmer who made a specialty of merino sheep and had several of their portraits painted life-size hanging in his parlor. About the time we were ready to go, there came from Cornwall, the next town, a man with 60 pounds of wool to be carded for his wife to spin. He was much disappointed to find that father wasn't here. And if he could have a few pounds of rolls, he'd come back another day for the rest. I felt confident I could card a few pounds, so he waited until I carded 6 pounds, and he went home well pleased. This is what the machines looked like that this little girl was dealing with. Of course, our visit was spoiled, but I had secured a 60-pound job, so what did I care? I live in Helen Britell's house now, and when I hear the water going over the dam out back, I think of her standing on a box by a machine like this carding wool, and of the other girls who were part of the merino boom. A naive agricultural community did not fully anticipate the pitfalls of specialization. In 1840, it seemed the sheep miracle would never end. And by 1850, the merino craze was almost over. How could this boom go bust in 1 decade? The burgeoning woolen mills were demanding cheaper wool to make cheaper clothing for the mass market. They were successful in their efforts so that the relaxing of government tariffs in the 1840 flooded the market with cheaper wool from the opening West. At this point, the West was like Ohio. It wasn't that far west. The Vermont industry's real disaster came in 1846 when the tariff on wool was eliminated completely. The opening of the Erie Canal and the coming of the railroads raised hopes for the new Western markets. But instead, Vermont was flooded with cheaper wool from Ohio and beyond. What do you do when it's costing you more to feed your sheep than you could get for your fleeces? Beneath all that wool, merinos are relatively small framed with little good meat for eating. So that wasn't an option. By the end of the decade, owners were slaughtering whole flocks because they couldn't afford to feed them. Up to 2/3 of the state's merinos were killed between 1846 and 1850. Vermont farmers now saw that there were dangers in putting all your eggs or your fleeces into one basket. The farmers were forced to turn back to older subsistence methods or to find other ways to survive on their land. In the next decade, many sold up for what they could get and took the new trains to the west, which then included western New York State, Ohio, and Michigan. But Vermont's reputation for breeding the greatest merinos did not die so quickly, particularly in Addison County. The Civil War brought a short revival of the industry as cotton from the South was unavailable and the Union Army was desperate for uniforms and blankets for the soldiers. A select few merino breeders continued to do well, selling breeding stock all over the world. Alonzo Bingham of Cornwall sold $53,402 of breeding merinos in 1 8-month period in 1850 to farmers from far away as Virginia and Michigan. A great merino ram could command stud fees of $3,000 and sell outright for $10,000. Later in the century, Addison County merinos were being sold to customers as far away as Australia and New Zealand. Spoiler alert, that's where most of the merino comes from today, Australia and New Zealand. They would soon come to dominate the merino craze. Edwin Hammond of Middlebury established what was probably the most famous merino flock in history by selectively working to breed a pure American merino. Oh, I should mention, these were the kind of houses these sheep breeders were able to build during this boom. So Edwin Hammond of Middlebury was trying to perfect the breeding stock and to make a perfect American merino with a fleece weighing up to 30 pounds. In 1865, he achieved this with Sweepstakes, who was regarded as the quintessential merino. And with a fleece, his fleece weighed 30 pounds. And rams were selling for huge prices, like $3,500. Stud fees could be very high as well. Simeon Rockwell made $20,000 in stud fees for a champion ram over 4 years in the mid-1860s. And boy, was that ram tired, I'm just saying. That was a busy boy. Some of his rams were like celebrities, known to all by name. The Middlebury Register carried what amounted to an obituary when Edwin Hammond's ram Goldrop died. Goldrop died in August 1865. It read, Mr. Hammond's best ram. Whoops, this jumped just a second. Mr. Hammond's best ram, Goldrop, died. It was valued at $25,000. You'd cry if your $25,000 ram died. This sheep probably had a reputation better than any other sheep that ever lived. He will be sadly mourned by all sheep breeders at home and abroad. But the end of the Civil War brought another collapse as the returning soldiers flooded the market with used clothing. The value of the dollar fell and the new tariffs favored imports over exports. Sheep slaughters began again. The biggest breeders had the money to hold on and to stock until because it still had value on the breeding market. In 1876, they started a pedigreed merino registry to regulate the trade. By this time, prize merinos, rams, were going as far as Texas and California. Vermont men traveled to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and South America selling breeding stock. It's kind of amazing to think of going from Vermont at that time to those far distant places. Luther Webster became known as one of the great livestock artists because they would send, if they couldn't go, they would send these drawings. Oh, that's an American merino stud. They would send these drawings. This is a Luther Webster. He was the most famous drawer of merinos, a merino artist. And he and his brother Frank both were artistically inclined, and they sold, they sent these kind of drawings. This is one that was at Shoreham, the sheep of E.B. Bissell in Shoreham. They would send these to potential buyers and make a lot of money for the guy who hired them. They would send etchings. They also did crayons and pen and ink drawings. Frank died young, but many of his meticulous drawings survive in the Sheldon Museum. Luther thrived following the agricultural fairs across the country. In the summer, fulfilling commissions to immortalize the farmers' pride breeders. Luther Webster's eye for a good merino was not solely artistic. He was enough of a specialist to be chosen to judge the sheep at the famed Chicago International Show. He also enjoyed another career in livestock journalism, serving as field editor of American Sheep Breeder and contributing to Shepherd's Criterion. He knew how to spot a prize sheep like few men of his age. Prize pedigree Vermont Merinos had spread all over the world, sales that would soon put the Vermont industry completely out of business. By World War I, there were almost no Merinos left in the state of Vermont. Most of the sheep lands had turned to dairying, as Vermont farmers sent out oceans of milk to the big industrial cities of the East Coast. And of course, this was possible because the railroads and had refrigerated cars to transport it. Many of the farmers who made the transition from sheep to dairying were very sad about it because, man, dairying's a whole lot more work. I mean, you got a couple really busy times in the sheep year, but you weren't milking sheep 2 or 3 times a day. Once lambing and shearing were over, they were pretty low maintenance. No one could say that about dairy cows between the milking and the cropping. With refrigerated train cars, a whole new world opened up to Vermont, but it also saved agriculture in Vermont when sheep were out of the picture. The Merino sheep boom and its bust taught Vermonters some happy lessons and some hard ones, as they went from a subsistence economy to specialization. Subsistence had made it possible for farms of all sizes to provide a living for families, but specialization had brought in the big money, sometimes huge fortunes. But it could also be risky in a world that was rapidly changing and where the producer had no control over tariffs. We are a nation of tree lovers and understand the importance of the ecological role they play. But people who grew up in the deforested Vermont of the sheep era missed its openness and tidy vistas once it was gone. I mean, you can see here, this is Mount Tom in Woodstock. Look, there are a few trees along the edge, but it's almost all completely deforested. And as one Vermont woman, Ruth Dutton, looked back from the 1930s to her childhood in the sheep era, she said, "I grew up on a farm, and someday I hope farms will come back. I'm looking for the day. Oh, it makes me sick. All these hills were open country, and a great many people had large flocks of sheep, and those pastures were grazed, and they were just like lawns. There was no brush scattered around. Well, all those hills are grown up now. No one who isn't very old can remember how they looked. The cattle and sheep were turned out in the spring, and got in the fall, and kept in the barns in the winter. You went once a week to salt them, and they were all right. They were happy. But now it's just all growing up to wilderness." That was just the worst word, wilderness, And I mean, you can see her point in the fact that, to her, the trees coming back represented the failure of so many of her friends and neighbors to be able to make it, especially on the hill farms. It was agriculture, more than all the other changes put together, that altered the look of the Vermont landscape in the 19th century. It was farmers who chopped down the trees and cleared out the brush, built houses and barns, planted the crops, created the meadows, and scattered them with sheep and horses and cows. A landscape that had once been overwhelmingly green and dark and dense with trees had been opened and swathed with all the colors of the crops: light greens and gold, golden wheat, blue flax, and red clover. Each color represented a choice that someone had made about how to use the land. The Green Valley pastures were planted with rows of corn, and the trees began to grow back on the mountainsides. The rich farmland of the valleys lay as multicolored tables below the large regreening of the green mountains. In lambing time in the spring, you can still stand outside on a cool spring night in Vermont, listening for the ghostly bleating of the lambs. Thank you. What should we name this little guy? Darn Tough? Does he look like a darn tough? So does anybody have any questions or comments?
My name's Phil Hobby. I'd like to actually just strengthen your argument about where did all the sheep go at the end of this great period. The modern Merino breeder is the opposite of the old Merino breeder. They really breed for less land because they get paid on the yield of the wool after it's washed.
Right.
And second, they really don't want all those folds.
I've heard this. They bred them up.
Yeah, and just remember, as I tell my story, the picture of all those folds in the neck. And if you're a shearer, you'll tell that story. I've been able to, since not being in no longer in the sheep business here, get out to help a friend on a ranch in Colorado, Utah. And you've all likely have seen her wool. She sold her clip with 2 other Merino breeders to Ralph Lauren, and it was the garments that are athletes for the U.S. wore for opening ceremonies.
Oh, cool.
And look for it in the winter because they just sold clips for the past 2 years for the winter Olympics.
Super.
So it's shearing time, and the shearing crew, a modern shearing crew, this one came in from Idaho, was headed by an Australian. 5 shearers, 3 wool classers, and the shearing is in a 30-foot long trailer, 35-foot long trailer, and they just shear 3,000 ewes in a couple of days. But the wool is no longer in wool bags like this. It's in bales, and to pack it, you need a wool baler. Well, on day 1, baler broke. I helped take apart. We decided that it was the piston, that was sort of like leaking. So we came off the Utah ranch into the Loma area of Colorado, and with the idea the next day we would work to fix it. Well, that evening, a few glasses of wine kind of flowed, and the crew, Mitch from Australia, was asking about Vermont. I said, well, I just live up the Connecticut River from Wethersfield Bow, where Jarvis brought in the first Merinos. And this is the story. Being a shearer, one of the hardest blows is when you're holding the neck back and going across the neck, because if you miss, it's kind of like, okay.
Right.
And those, to this day, there's an occasional Merino in Australia that will come out with the extra folds. And I can't repeat exactly what you said, but those. So to this day, Vermont is throwing genetics into Australia.
Thanks, Phil. That's great. That's a great update. Thank you. Any other questions?
What's the average lifespan of the sheep?
That's a really good question, and it's probably changed. I don't know. I don't think they live to be all that old, that they keep them for all that long. Do you know?
I didn't hear the question.
What's the average lifespan now for a Merino?
10 to 12 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Usually between 8 to 10, you have to be checking for teeth to make sure they have their teeth.
So you still like it deep enough. Yeah. Okay. There you go. Anyone else? Yeah? Is there one back here that I'm not seeing?
Want something, John?
Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Did I miss one over here? Yeah?
Well, actually, my question followed hers. What did they do with the sheep? I suppose they slaughtered them, and they must have eaten them.
I
I've
don't
never
think
seen
so.
a mutton recipe.
No, no, I don't think they did eat them. They probably dug a pit and put them in it. I don't think there was so little meat on a merino. I've never heard of anyone eating a merino. I don't think it was the greatest, even if it didn't, it wasn't just not having that much. I don't think it was that tasty. It had to be a lot of tears, you know. So there's one back here.
Hi, does anybody know what percentage of Vermont was deforested before the sheep came? I was under the impression they were taking trees down to make potash or something. I don't know what potash is.
Yes. Well, when, before the European settlers came in, Vermont was probably, 80% forested. There were some meadows, and Native people were farming at that point. So they had, especially along the rivers, they had, settlements that were semi-permanent at that point. So there had been clearing for their agriculture. But, once the settlers came and really started going to town, it became 75 to 80% deforested. And now it's exactly the reverse, 75 to 80% forested again. So I wish just for 1 minute I could see that deforested landscape. It would be kind of fascinating, but I wouldn't go through it to see it.
I tell
Yes.
you, there is one landscape that, North Bridgewater Road, but if you go about 3 miles up the road, there's a guy who cut down all the forest right around the old field. And that is something to see, because
It must look so.
something like.
Must have been sort of what it was like, And then when they were cutting them down the first time, it's not easy to cut, native hardwoods. They were so hard. Those trees that had never been cut, they were so hard. In fact, they had a thing in Middlebury where, they had cleared the green, but there were stumps all over the green. And for decades, if you got thrown into the drunk tank, you couldn't get out till you had dug out one of those huge old stumps. So you can tell, it's all clear now. There must have been a lot of those guys.
The initial clear cutting and then the arrival of the sheep led to a lot of environmental damage to the landscape in the state as far as erosion, silting, and all that sort of.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And if you look, I'm going to go back to that picture of Mount Tom. I don't know how many of you have heard of George Perkins Marsh, but he was from Woodstock, and he really wrote the first book that argued that people could kill the planet, basically. The first book that said, because people decide, it doesn't matter, it just heals itself, it just takes care of itself. Nature is a self-perpetuating system. And his book, Man and Nature, which came out during the Civil War period, was the first to say, no, we really could destroy this. We've got to be more responsible. And he had seen a lot of landscapes in Europe where it was all cleared out. All the good soil had eroded down into the bottomlands. And it was just, like the moon, And he felt this watching what happened to Mount Tom as he was growing up. He saw a lot of the soil wash away. And it was part of what inspired the first really great environmental work. So, yes?
I'm curious about the boom and what made Vermont unique. If Jarvis was sending them to Virginia and the sheep were all over, why did Vermont get uniquely carried away in this?
There were scattered ones, but I think it's really Jarvis. A lot of it is Jarvis gave a lot more to people here. We sold some, and there were pockets of them in all those eastern states. But there weren't as many alternatives in Vermont as there were in some places. You know, Vermont was better for sheep, whereas if you were in Virginia, you could do anything. You know, it was there were more options. So I think that was a good part of it. Yes.
So what made the sheep from the west, from Illinois and Michigan, less expensive? What was their edge?
It was just easier to farm out in those big flat lands, you know, and so I think it was cheaper. I don't know the microeconomics of it, but I think it was just cheaper to grow them out there, as it was with almost everything, you know. Over here.
So in answering the question of what ended the boom is a combination of the tariffs and the West opening up.
Yeah, I mean, Vermonters, when the trains came, you know, in the 1850s and early 60s, Vermonters thought, oh, this is great, because now we can send our, you know, wool to a bigger market. But, you know, it didn't work out that way. They just, you know, just started sending theirs this way to our woolen mills instead, you know, and that was it. Go ahead.
Just in addition to deforesting, I've seen this deforestation in the tropics, particularly in Nicaragua years ago. And the way they do it, they often leave the hardest trees out there, girdle them, and they might take them 50 years to topple a thing, but I'll bet that they were doing that with things like hot corn beans.
Yeah, I'm sure they did some, but the farmers here were so desperate to clear it as fast as they could. I don't know how many had the patience to wait for that method. And they were making their first money they made was on potash, where they burn those stumps and things down, and they sent a lot of that to England because it was a chemical that they used in the Industrial Revolution for a lot of the new industrial processes over there. So that was where a lot of Vermont farmers first made a little money, was in their clearing they had a little byproduct they could sell. Like here?
I wonder how many of you have been to Iceland? Anybody?
No.
There are no trees.
I've heard
Why? When I took photographs, almost every photograph has a sheep in it. They have, the sheep have just decimated the forest. The few little areas that are fenced off to keep the sheep out have trees. They're not very big, they're birch trees and they don't grow real tall. So I can imagine, as John was saying, that first you cut what you could, there were some trees left. But then when the sheep started coming in and they nibbled all the saplings, all the brush, and soon it was just bare.
Wow, yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah, I never really thought, you always see those very bare pictures of Iceland, but I never realized that they too got that way.
The nation has one herd. They're owned in common, but they ran into trouble. They had some kind of disease, I've forgotten what was brought in, and so they built a fence across the entire length of the country, so now they have two herds. So if something happens to one, it's still be okay.
Until one flock downs that fence and gets everything.
I had a thought about the Midwest, why it was cheaper to raise sheep there. I'm thinking of the winter, we had to feed the sheep a lot of grain in the winter. And it's a lot easier to grow wheat and corn, the grain out there than here.
Well, it's easier to grow the grain, but it's a lot colder. It's a lot longer winter, but I guess it was still worth it because the grain could be grown a lot cheaper. That's for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Do I see a hand over here? Yeah.
If you want to see pictures of the deforestation, the Green Mountain Club in Marjorie has historical pictures of when they built the long trail in 1910, and people hiking on the trail as they built it and stuff, and people started complaining when they let the trees grow back, they couldn't see the view anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure they did. I think there were beautiful views. There's a place on Route 7 when you're going through, is it Shelburne or Charlotte there, where there was this incredible vista of Lake Champlain as you're driving down, as you're driving south. And Stephen Rockefeller, when he was at Middlebury College, he bought that whole stretch so it would be preserved. But the trees were like little when he was here. And now they've gone, there are a few little places you can see it, but it's kind of, I do miss that vista. But, you know, it's better for the planet. I'm sure that's true too. Yes?
Yeah, so what happened to all the lanolin? Was it ever harvested? Was it ever used? I mean, lanolin, we use it to wipe our hands and for moisturizer. We also use it for tear gas.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Acrolein.
Wow.
Acrolein, which is a derivative of lanolin.
Yeah. I never heard of it as a byproduct, but it may well have been, especially for hands. That's a really good question, but I've never read that. Yeah. Anything else?
You got any comments on sheep and how they were, farmers had trouble with dogs chasing the sheep?
Yeah.
They pile up in a corner of walls and trample each other to death.
I have heard of that.
They got a slick man up, the story from my family where they're doing that. And then a slick man come up to show them the damage was being done by dogs chasing the sheep.
Yeah.
Well, they had problems there.
Yeah, that's why you need dogs.
They can shoot dogs on sight at one time if they're chasing the sheep.
If they were chasing them, yeah, you needed ones that would get them out of the corner though. The other kind of dogs. That's really interesting. Yeah, my dad said that about turkeys when he raised turkeys. They would just smother themselves. Yeah.
Well, sheep aren't the smartest animals in the world. So in Vermont, you know, there were these miles and miles and miles of stone walls, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's all you needed because a sheep won't step over anything that's like 2 feet
Well, that's true.
tall. So
I know, you think that, I thought we were supposed to go to sleep thinking of jumping over them. I guess not, that's why we're not sleeping. Yeah, that's really interesting. So anyway, well, thank you all so much for coming. It's been great.